1930. Tens of thousands of Americans are about to lose control of their own legs, not from a battlefield injury, not from a disease with a name anyone recognized, from a bottle of medicine sold completely legally in pharmacies, drugstores, and general stores across the country. It starts small. A man in Oklahoma notices his toes won't lift properly when he walks. A woman in Mississippi finds her foot slapping the ground with every step, like she can't control where it lands. Doctors in small towns across the American South and Midwest start seeing the same strange, shuffling gait over and over in patients who have nothing else in common. Not the same age, not the same job, not the same neighborhood, except one thing. Almost every single one of them had recently taken a bottle of an over-the-counter digestive remedy that millions of ordinary Americans kept in their medicine cabinets. We're not going to resolve that yet, because to understand how a kitchen spice ended up at the center of one of the largest mass poisonings in American history, we have to go back 5,000 years, to Southeast Asia, and a root so valuable that it would one day be traded for a live sheep. Ginger is one of the strangest plants humans have ever domesticated, for a very specific reason. It doesn't exist in the wild, anywhere. There is no forest, no jungle, no remote island where you can find a wild ginger plant that isn't descended from human cultivation. Every rhizome growing today traces back to people who started farming it so long ago that the wild ancestor has simply vanished from the historical record. That's worth sitting with for a second. Every piece of ginger you have ever eaten, in every dish, in every drink, only exists because people were deliberately growing this plant before anyone was writing anything down. Compare that to something like a wild strawberry or a wild apple, both of which still grow untouched in forests today, completely independent of human cultivation. Ginger has no such backup version. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, thousands of years ago, a wild ancestor did exist, and human hands took over its reproduction so completely and so early that the original line simply disappeared, absorbed entirely into the domesticated crop we still grow today. The domestication happened in Southeast Asia, and the people who carried it out into the world were the Austronesians, the same seafaring peoples who would go on to settle islands across an enormous stretch of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Ginger became what's sometimes called a canoe plant, a species so essential to survival and trade that voyaging communities packed it deliberately for every new island they settled. It moved with them into India. From India, it moved west, along overland and maritime trade routes controlled by Arab merchants. And by the 1st century AD, it had reached the Roman Empire, where it picked up a reputation that would follow it for the next 2,000 years. A reliable remedy for an upset stomach. Roman physicians and naturalists catalogued it alongside pepper and other imported spices, treating it as both a flavoring for the wealthy table and a genuine piece of medical equipment, something a household with means would keep on hand the way a modern household keeps antacids in a bathroom cabinet. Rome loved this root. But it's what happened to its price after the Roman Empire collapsed that turns this into a genuinely strange story. For centuries after Rome fell, the spice trade into Europe stayed almost entirely in the hands of Arab merchants, who controlled the routes ginger traveled on from source to market and, crucially, controlled what Europe was told about where it came from. Vague, exotic origin stories kept buyers from ever finding the source themselves and cutting out the middlemen. Merchants had every incentive to make the source sound impossibly distant and dangerous to reach, discouraging anyone in Europe from even attempting to cut them out. The result was scarcity, and scarcity meant price. In 13th and 14th century England, a single pound of ginger was worth exactly the same as a live sheep. Think about what that actually means. A spice, a flavoring, something you'd use a pinch of in a dish, cost the same as an entire animal capable of producing wool, milk, and meat for years. Ginger wasn't a seasoning for ordinary households. It was a luxury good, a fixture in the kitchens and apothecary cabinets of the wealthy, prescribed as medicine as often as it was used in cooking. Apothecaries stocked it alongside far more expensive imports like saffron and cloves, and merchants who dealt in it were often among the wealthiest tradespeople in their cities, since a single successful shipment could represent a genuine fortune. It picked up quite a reputation along the way, too. Medieval medical writers, including physicians at the influential school of Salerno in Italy, promoted ginger as an aphrodisiac, with guidance that essentially promised, "Eat ginger, and you will love and be loved as in your youth." Henry VIII reportedly recommended a ginger compound as a remedy during outbreaks of plague, a claim that says more about the desperation of the era than the actual medicinal power of a root. And there's a popular legend, still repeated constantly today, crediting Elizabeth I with inventing the gingerbread man, supposedly having her court bakers craft gingerbread likenesses of visiting dignitaries. It's a wonderful story. Historians can't actually confirm it happened the way it's told, so we'll treat it the same way we've treated legends in past episodes. Worth mentioning, not worth believing outright. Value like that, concentrated in the hands of a few merchants controlling a monopoly, is always a target for someone else to break. And what one empire's ships did next didn't just end that monopoly. It physically relocated this plant to the opposite side of the planet. By 1525, Spanish colonists had smuggled a tropical Asian root onto a Caribbean island, and within 20 years, it had crashed the price of one of the most valuable commodities in Europe. The island was Jamaica. Ginger thrived in its climate almost immediately, and Spanish planters, moving quickly and well ahead of any official approval from the crown, spread cultivation into Hispaniola and Puerto Rico as well. By 1547, just over 2 decades after its introduction, Jamaica alone was exporting more than 1,000 tons of ginger a year back across the Atlantic. That made ginger arguably the first Old World spice to be successfully naturalized in the Americas and shipped back to the very continent it had come from, completing a strange round trip across an ocean nobody from Southeast Asia had ever crossed. It's a genuinely unusual milestone in the history of global trade. Most spices that Europeans went searching for stayed rooted in their original regions for centuries, dependent on long, dangerous supply lines controlled by whoever happened to hold the ports along the way. Ginger broke that pattern almost immediately, transplanted, thriving, and exporting within a single generation of first arriving in the Caribbean. The flood of Caribbean-grown ginger did to the European market exactly what you'd expect. Flooding a market with cheap supply always does. The cheap-priced luxury of the 14th century collapsed into an everyday spice within 2 generations. Suddenly, ordinary households could afford what only the wealthy had been able to touch 100 years earlier. The merchants, who had once controlled the overland trade routes, had no answer for a supply chain that no longer ran through their hands at all. The monopoly wasn't broken by a treaty or a war. It was broken by a plant thriving somewhere nobody expected it to. Cheap, abundant ginger looks like an unambiguous win for absolutely everyone involved, and for the most part, it was. It fueled centuries of gingerbread baking, spreading across working-class kitchens throughout Europe by the 1800s. It gave rise to ginger beer, first brewed in English-controlled Jamaica after 1655, a fermented, spicy drink that would eventually spin off into the milder, mass-produced ginger ale still sold today. Sailors on long ocean voyages relied on it to settle seasick stomachs and calm digestive trouble on ships with nothing resembling modern medicine on board. And captains often kept a supply in the galley, specifically because a crew that couldn't keep food down was a crew that couldn't work. For roughly 300 years, ginger's story reads like a simple, satisfying tale of a luxury good becoming a democratized comfort. But 300 years later, in a country that had just made alcohol illegal, this exact plant would be sitting at the center of one of the biggest public health scandals America has ever quietly forgotten. Before you assume that a natural remedy sold legally in a pharmacy is automatically safe, watch what happened to tens of thousands of Americans in 1930. This is where the cold open finally pays off. During Prohibition, the Volstead Act, which banned the sale of alcoholic beverages across the United States, carved out an exemption for medicine. Doctors could still prescribe alcohol-based tinctures for legitimate ailments, and pharmacists could still sell them. One product exploited that loophole harder than almost anything else on the market: an extract known as Jamaica ginger, sold openly as a treatment for stomach trouble and headaches, but consumed by an enormous number of people almost entirely because it was 70 to 80% alcohol by volume. For people with few other legal ways to get a drink, especially poorer Americans without connections to organized bootlegging operations, Jamaica ginger, nicknamed Jake, became remarkably popular. It was cheap. It was sold openly over the counter without anything resembling a real prescription requirement, and a small bottle could deliver a stronger kick than most of the moonshine circulating through the same rural communities. Federal regulators eventually caught on and began testing these tonics for alcohol content, trying to force manufacturers to actually dilute the product down to something resembling medicine rather than liquor in disguise. One Boston-based manufacturing operation found a shortcut. To fool the standard federal testing method, which measured a specific physical property tied to alcohol concentration, they adulterated their ginger extract with a cheap industrial chemical called triorthocresyl phosphate. It passed the test. Nobody flagged it as dangerous because almost nobody outside a narrow slice of industrial chemistry had any reason to know what it actually did to the human nervous system. It was cheap, it was widely available for industrial use, and on paper, it looked like a convenient substitute for the alcohol the regulators were trying to detect. It turned out to be a slow-acting neurotoxin. Victims didn't get sick right away. The poisoning had a delay built into it, which made the connection to Jamaica ginger far harder for doctors to initially trace. Weeks after drinking a tainted bottle, people started developing numbness in their hands and feet, followed by foot drop, an inability to lift the front of the foot while walking, which forced them into a distinctive, shuffling, slapping gait. In many cases, the nerve damage was permanent. The condition got a folk nickname almost immediately: Jake Leg or Jake Walk, and it became common enough and visible enough that it worked its way into American culture directly, memorialized in an entire wave of blues songs written by musicians who had watched it spread through their own communities. Estimates of how many people were affected vary widely across different sources, ranging anywhere from 30,000 to as high as 100,000 Americans, the overwhelming majority of them poor. When the manufacturers behind the adulteration were eventually caught, they were fined and sentenced to 2 years in prison, a strikingly small consequence given the scale of permanent harm involved, and a sentence that did nothing at all for the tens of thousands of people who would spend the rest of their lives walking with a limp nobody in their town could fully explain. And this wasn't even the last time this exact compound caused a mass poisoning. In 1959, triorthocresyl phosphate turned up again, this time contaminating cooking oil in Morocco, paralyzing roughly 10,000 more people on a completely different continent, decades later, in a completely unrelated supply chain. Almost nobody remembers any of this today. Jake Leg has largely vanished from popular memory of the Prohibition era, overshadowed by speakeasies and bootleggers and gangster mythology. But it quietly became one of the early warning signs that helped shape how food and drug safety gets regulated in America to this day. Most people have never heard of what stands as one of the largest mass poisonings in American history, and there's a fairly uncomfortable reason for that. The victims were poor. They were concentrated in rural communities across the South and Midwest, drinking a cheap, legal tonic because it was one of the only intoxicants available to them under Prohibition, and almost nobody with real political or media power was paying close attention to what happened to them. At the time, there were no requirements forcing manufacturers to test products for safety before putting them on the market. A company could adulterate a product, sell it nationwide, and only face consequences after the damage had already been done to tens of thousands of people. Jake Leg didn't single-handedly cause federal drug law to change. That shift is more directly tied to a separate disaster in 1937, when a sulfur drug, mixed with a toxic solvent, killed more than 100 people and helped push through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. But Jake Leg came first, an earlier tremor that showed regulators exactly what could happen when nobody was required to check. A warning largely ignored for years by lawmakers who had little political incentive to protect a population without much of a voice in Washington. What if the very thing that turned this plant into a global commodity, cheap, fast-growing, easily transplanted, is also the thing that keeps leaving entire countries' harvests one bad season away from collapse? Today, India stands as the largest producer of ginger in the world, growing it across a range of climates and regions that gives the country enormous resilience against any single crop failure. Nigeria has risen to become the second largest producer globally, with commercial cultivation there dating back to the 1920s and expanding dramatically in the decades since. China remains a major grower and exporter as well, feeding both domestic demand and international markets. And then there's Jamaica, the very island where this whole modern chapter of the story began 500 years ago. Jamaica's ginger industry has collapsed dramatically from its historic peak. Rhizome rot and bacterial wilt devastated production through the early 1990s, turning the island that once exported over 1,000 tons a year into a net importer of the very spice it helped globalize. A blight in 2023 destroyed up to 95% of the crop in some of the country's remaining growing regions. A brutal reminder of how fragile a plant this genetically narrow can be, even after 5 centuries of cultivation. It's a strange inversion of the very story that made ginger famous in the first place. The plant that once broke a European monopoly by thriving somewhere new is now, in the place where that break first happened, struggling to survive at all, while other countries on the other side of the planet inherit the advantage instead. Everything you think you know about the gingerbread man's origin traces back to one specific queen, though historians still aren't fully sure the legend is even true. That Elizabeth I story, her court bakers supposedly crafting gingerbread likenesses of visiting foreign dignitaries, remains unconfirmed, charming, and almost certainly, at least partly embellished, over the centuries it's been retold. There's a quieter irony worth noting too. Ginger ale went on to become a staple mixer in Prohibition-era cocktails, the same era that Jamaica ginger nearly destroyed for tens of thousands of people. Two very different fates for two products of the same root, sold in the same decade, marketed to two very different Americas that rarely thought about each other at all. And centuries before either of those stories, Roman writers had already nicknamed ginger something like the antacid of the ancient world, a reputation for settling stomachs that has, remarkably, never really gone away, echoed today in every glass of flat ginger ale handed to someone with a stomach bug, 2,000 years after a Roman apothecary might have prescribed the exact same root for the exact same complaint. A root once worth as much as a live sheep, smuggled across an ocean by colonists who didn't wait for permission, crashed in value so completely that it went from a treasure locked in wealthy kitchens to something stocked on every grocery store shelf on the planet. and centuries later, turned by simple, calculated greed into one of the largest, least remembered mass poisonings in American history. Today it sits, completely unremarkable, in a small jar in the spice rack of nearly every kitchen on Earth. Next time you reach for it, you might think about Jake Leg, about a root with no wild ancestor, about a queen who may or may not have invented a cookie, and about a sheep in medieval England worth exactly as much as the spice sitting in your cupboard right now. That's really the thing about food history. The most ordinary object on your shelf is usually hiding the strangest story in the room. And ginger, cheap, familiar, and sitting quietly in nearly every kitchen on the planet, might be one of the strangest of all.